What we're going to look at today is frightening. In fact, it's actually terrifying. It's terrifying like when you see people with a cigarette packet walking down the street smoking a fag, and there's a big sign these days that says, "Warning, smoking kills." And that's frightening. You see people, you be chatting to someone you know, and they're holding it there, and it's scary. And what we're going to look at now is equally frightening. In fact, I'd actually say it's more frightening, because we're going to see a habit that we all do, and we're going to see how the consequences are disastrous. And Matthew isn't an easy book. I must say, when we started the church, I was kind of thinking it would be good to start in Matthew because it's a gospel and it will be kind of easy. and then I realized like it's not easy at all. And I understand now why some people say they think Matthew wrote it as a discipleship manual, because it's proper hard to live out these things. But it's worth it. It's a small price to do these things for our Savior who laid down his life for us. So the topic today is don't judge. Matthew 7 verses 1 to 6. So let's start off. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. It appears here, what he's saying is don't be judgmental. Because the context suggests that when he says don't judge, he's talking about harsh judgments we make about people. Judgments we make about people when we don't have humility and where we don't consider where we're at ourselves, but we just keep looking at other people's faults. So it appears it's talking about being judgmental, and it's talking about judging people's actions. And one way to understand it would be to imagine it judging people's motives. Quite often we find ourselves doing that. We judge someone's motives for doing something when we don't really know what their motives are, but we assume what their motives are, and then we get in a bad mood with them about it. Now, it's important as we study this to see the context of what Jesus is saying here, because too many people have used this verse to condone bad behavior. I bet, well, let's see a show of hands. Has anyone here ever seen someone where you might have confronted them about a sin in their life, or it might have just come up and then they've said, "Well, you shouldn't judge, mate"? See a show of hands. Who's seen it? Right. Okay, yeah, thought so. So many people have used this verse in a different way to how Jesus intended it. They just use it to condone bad behavior. If I say to you guys, like, don't judge, straight away in your mind, you're going to start trying to work out, what do I mean? Like, if I say don't judge, do I mean when you cross the road, don't judge how fast the cars are coming so that you don't get hit? Do I mean if a false teacher comes into the church and stands up and says, "Look, everyone, I'm the new Messiah, come and follow me," should you not judge and say, "Well, that's okay, we go and do that"? So when you hear me say don't judge, you'll be in your mind thinking, okay, what exactly does Duncan mean? And what you'll be doing is using hermeneutics to try and work out what I mean. And that's what we need to do today. So as we study this, it will become clearer what Jesus means when he says do not judge. But for now, on the topic of don't be judgmental, I think it's good to just be aware that we all do it. We all start nitpicking at other people's faults. You find something that bothers us. It can even be in a friend. And you find something that bothers us about them, and you think about it, and you dwell on it, and you start judging them about it. And within a few weeks, you've found 3 other things that bother you about them. And your list starts building up. And then someone later will say, "Oh, you know, so-and-so, he's a real good guy." And you'll go, because you've been building up this huge list of all these little things that bother you about them. And that's when it's time to realize, oh, this is what Jesus was chatting about. I'm judging people in the wrong way. I'm being judgmental. So, some judgments are allowed in the Bible. We're not going to study which these ones are today, but I'm just going to bring them to your attention. First one is making judgments about false prophets. You got Matthew 7:20. Talking about false prophets, Jesus says, "So then you will recognize them by their fruit." Obviously, that involves some kind of judgment. You got a false prophet, you look at his fruit and you try and weigh up, is this good fruit or bad fruit? So that is a judgment. Matthew 16:6, Jesus said, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." So that's a judgment about the Sadducees and Pharisees. Another kind of judgment is judgment about recipients of evangelism. Okay? judgments about recipients of evangelism. In Matthew 10:14, this is what Jesus says to the disciples, and it's quite shocking because when he sends them out on their outreach, he says, "And if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your message, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or that town." So Jesus was actually telling them, make a judgment about the guys that you're doing evangelism to, and if they're not responding, then it's time to move on. So there's another kind of judgment we can make. And a really important one here, the third one, is judging about right and wrong. John 7:24, Jesus said, "Do not judge according to external appearance, but judge with proper judgment." And that was when he'd healed someone on the Sabbath, and people are going, "Whoa." And Jesus is saying you need to make a right judgment. He's saying they need to judge about, is it right or wrong that he healed someone on the Sabbath? So there's nothing wrong with, you see something happen, and in your mind you're thinking, is this a right thing to do, or is this a wrong thing to do? Nothing wrong with doing that if you do it in a righteous way. And the last one, and this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, these are just the ones I thought of, judging about offences. And that's offences that might be done to you, or offences that are done to someone in the church, and the church leadership has to make a judgment about it. You all know this one, Matthew 18, starting at verse 15. "If your brother sins, go and show him his fault when the two of you are alone. If he listens to you, you have regained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others with you, so that at the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter may be established. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen to the church, treat him like a Gentile or a tax collector." So here we've got a case where someone's wronged by someone else, and they go to them and say, "Brother, I feel that you've wronged me." And if the guy doesn't listen, eventually it goes to the church leadership, and the church leadership have to say, you know, we're putting you out of fellowship. Treat them like a tax collector or a Gentile. They're not in the fellowship. So there are judgments that can be made. We're not really we'll study those, but these are all going to come up. You can see a number of these in Matthew, so we're going to come to them one day. But I just wanted to make it clear, when Jesus says, do not judge, we've got to understand what kind of judging he's talking about. So now we're going to move on to the scary bit. If we judge others, God will judge us. If we judge others, God will judge us. It says, do not judge so that you will not be judged. There's 2 ways you could view it. You could view it as meaning, well, other people on the street will judge you if they see you being judgmental. But what you find, you might remember way back I taught you guys what a passive was in grammar. An active action is something that I do to someone. A passive action is an action that is done to me. And in the New Testament, a lot of the times when you've got a passive verb, something that's done to you, it's what they call a divine passive. You all know what divine means, right? Like God, yeah? So what it means is divine passive, this action is being done by God. It's a way of avoiding writing God in a verse. So this could most probably be read as so that you will not be judged by God, which makes a lot of sense because it doesn't really matter if people out in the street are judging us. That's their responsibility, it's not ours. But here it's saying he will judge us. Now, that's important because if we realize this, we're not going to judge other people so much, are we? You know, if we had this written up on the wall of the kitchen, you know, and kept seeing that every day, then we might be like, well, I'm going to stop judging people because God will judge me. That is a scary thought. It should be written up on every wall of your house probably, just like the smokers with their cigarette packets. You know, it doesn't seem to do them much good. They've got the thing saying, warning, smoking kills. And we laugh at them because we see them smoking their fag. And yet in our Bible it tells us this, don't judge so you won't be judged. And then we go around judging people. So to try and stick it in your head. Warning, don't judge so that you won't be judged. I chose the cigarette packet because it shows the seriousness of judging people. I found it frightening studying this week. So, let's check out the next bit. Matthew 7 verse 2. For by the standard you judge, you will be judged. and the measure you use will be the measure you receive. So this is saying we'll be judged by the same standards that we judge others. The NRSV puts this really well. They say, the measure you give will be the measure you get. I'd like to get a t-shirt with that written on it. The measure you give will be the measure you get. Now, scary. Back then in the marketplace, they would have the measuring scales for weighing stuff. So Jewish people would have understood this when he's saying measure. And there were Jewish texts that used measuring scales talking about God's judgment on the last day. So the Jewish people would have understood this as God is going to judge me one day for these things. Scary thought. Check this out in Romans 2 verse 1. Therefore, you are without excuse, whoever you are, when you judge someone else, for on whatever grounds you judge another, you condemn yourself because you who judge practice the same things. See, it's not an easy teaching today. I say, right, we judge someone, we're like, oh, he's like this, he's like that. Straight away, we've set ourselves up to be judged because when we do the same things, God has heard us judge these other people. And there was a philosopher who once said that even if you don't believe in the Ten Commandments, okay, if you've got to admit that one day, if you're judged by the same standards that you've judged other people, you're guilty and you've got to go to hell. So when people are driving and they're like, look at that guy, he just cut in front of me. Now, you can never cut in front of someone else when you're driving with a clear conscience because you've just set the standard. Or you say, that person, they gossiped about me. You can never gossip about someone else now because you've just set the standard. You're saying, this is the law I live by, and then you go and break it. So this is hard. And in the Old Testament, if you had a false witness at a trial and you got found out, you would be punished with the punishment of the person who you were being a false witness against. Okay, this is Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, chapter 19, verses 18 to 19. The judges will thoroughly investigate the matter, and if the witness should prove to be false and to have given false testimony against the accused, you must do to him what he had intended to do to the accused. In this way you will purge evil from among you. This is terrifying. You know, this is God's law. He's saying if someone is a false witness to someone, they got to be punished with the punishment the other guy would have got. So we can see something about the way God works here. You know, it's like whatever you give is what you're going to get. The measure you judge other people is the measure that I'm going to judge you by. I'm very glad for Jesus' blood on the cross. So it's so important to know this for when we start finding ourselves judging other people, to realize we're now setting the standard for God to judge us. And he's told us in the Bible, we've got no excuse for it. So the next time you're thinking about someone and you're thinking, they don't spend their time wisely, they seem kind of lazy, remember that you've just set the standard now. You can't ever be lazy in your life. Or you think, you know, that person, they just don't really seem to be as good a Christian as me because they don't seem to read their Bible as much as me. Well, if you now go through a bad week and you're not reading your Bible much, you know, you've already set the standard for it. So we've got to be so careful. But it's hard to do. It's hard to do. So rather than say, okay, now I've judged that person, I'll make sure I never do that, because we know that won't work. It's easier to just say, I won't judge anyone in the first place. So as soon as we find ourselves judging someone, be like, no, this is what Jesus said I shouldn't do. I don't want to get judged by God for doing the same thing in a week's time, so I'm just going to stop myself. I don't want God to deal with me in the same manner I deal with other people. So we don't want God to be as harsh as us as we are with other people. And I think a good sort of thing to check, when you find yourself judging someone, ask yourself, have they sinned against me? Like, is this a genuine case when I can go to them and say, friend, I feel you've sinned against me by doing such and such? Or are you in some position of leadership where it is your right to say to someone, I feel what you're doing is destroying the body right now. We need to talk about this. If it's not one of those two things, then we probably need to say, you know, I'm just nitpicking. This is just my sinful nature, and I'm going to repent of it and stop it. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that anyone in a position of leadership can judge however they want. I'm only talking about in specific contexts of, some sin that's destroying the church. And we'll come to that later in the Gospel of Matthew. So this is such a hard teaching, and it's so terrifying. But now what happens is Jesus gives us an amusing illustration, which shows what a wonderful teacher Jesus was, because he's saying something that's frightening. I mean, you can imagine people ready to burst into tears. And then Jesus says something that's so funny in verse 3. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to see the beam of wood in your own? Now, the question I have for us is, could this be something Jesus would say to you today? Could it be something he'd say to me today? I think he's definitely been saying it to me this week as I've been studying it. What's interesting is that beforehand, when Jesus says you, he's using you in the plural sense, like he's chatting to a bunch of people. And now when he says you, it's actually you in the singular sense. You can see it clearly in the Greek. It's like Jesus is now talking to one person. Now, it could be that Matthew, when he's compiling the gospel, has now taken this bit from a different oral tradition and put the two together. It could be that Jesus actually said this to one person. And I wonder if I was sitting there, if I would be the one person that Jesus would say that to. Probably. And I'm not saying he definitely did say this to one person, but it's just interesting. Now he is actually saying you, as in, like he's pointing the finger and saying you. That kind of thing. So when I saw this, I just thought, boy, is Jesus saying this to me right now, kind of thing? Like, is he saying, Duncan, why do you look at the speck in someone else's eye? You've got a big beam in your own eye. And a beam is a beam that holds up a house. When you're building a house, you've got a big beam there. So here's someone looking at a tiny speck, maybe a piece of sawdust or something, in someone else's eye, and Jesus is like, bruv, you're looking at his bit of sawdust, you could build a house with the piece of wood in your eye. And this brings us on to the next thing. Specks are small, but they bother us so much. I don't know why this is, but there's something about specks in other people's eyes really bother us. Tiny little small things. And I think it's worth realizing this is a universal problem. I hope it is. I hope it's not just me. You see a little fault in someone, and you're like, and then you start noticing other faults, and it really bugs you. And I don't know why this is, but Jesus said it happens, so I know it happens. I've seen it myself. So it's important for us to be aware we can easily get obsessed with specks in other people's lives. So let's safeguard against getting worked up about small specks, because they lead to a much bigger problem in our own lives. And this is the problem. We start focusing on other people's problems instead of focusing on our own problem. And that's not the way of a disciple. And I think this is probably the major cause of being judgmental, is when we stop focusing on our own sin and we start trying to focus on sin in other people's lives. The beginning of Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes, we've been through all that where Jesus says, blessed are those that mourn. Blessed are the meek. Nowhere does it say, blessed are those who judge. It doesn't say that at all. It also says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But it doesn't say those who hunger and thirst for their neighbor's righteousness, who are always bothered about their neighbor living righteously. It says, your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. But it doesn't say you must make sure that the righteousness of your neighbor exceeds that. Can't remember if it actually said exceed those of the Pharisees or Sadducees, but you know what I mean. And then the other week we saw how he said, seek first his righteousness. It didn't say seek first that your neighbor be righteous. First thing we've got to seek is the kingdom, God ruling in our lives, and his righteousness, living by his standards. So the emphasis is all on dealing with ourselves, and it's not on dealing with other people. And I just wonder, right, what kind of church would we be if we went around correcting one another all the time? I don't think anyone would want to come. I don't think I would want to come. I'm an easy target as well at the front. But what if instead, as a church, as individuals in a church, whenever we saw a fault in someone else, we then thought, hang on a minute, is there a beam in my own eye right now? And then we dealt with sin in our life. If you think about it, that would be a much better way of working as a body, and we would probably end up being better people and a better church. You know, because every time we're like, oh, that speck in his eye is bugging me. Then we're like, hang on, what's going on in my life? I deal with the plank in my own life, and then that guy with the speck, when he looks at the speck in my eye, and then he deals with the plank in his life, we're going to get rid of all our planks instead of just getting rid of specks in other people's eyes. And we're going to like one another a lot more as well in the process. So next time we see a fault in our brothers or sisters, let's just ask ourselves, hang on a minute, is this really a big deal? Because their small speck is actually a small deal compared with the sin in my life. And when God looks down, he wants me to deal with the sin in my life. So then we put the focus back on our own lives. So next, Jesus explains the impracticality of judging people this way. Verse 4. Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye while there is a beam in your own? Now, just to help you get this, imagine if I went out in the street now, just out here, and I went up to people and I said, like one of them candid camera things, mate, there's something in your eye, come in. There's a little thing in your eye, let me get it out for you. Like, what are they going to think? They're going to think I'm nuts. And there's no way I can get close enough to them anyway. I'm going to give them a black eye in the process. And this is the picture Jesus paints for us. You know, it's impractical. And Jesus is showing us here, don't assume to be in a better place than someone else is. Because the wording here is a polite request to help someone. It's actually, you can see it clearer in the Greek. When they say, let me remove the speck, it's like a polite thing. It's like, mate, let me remove the speck from your eye. It's as if you're being really helpful and you're assuming like, you need me to help you with that. I'm the guy who can do it. And it's assuming that we're in a better place than someone else is. It also assumes that we don't have that speck and we know how to get specks out, which is ridiculous if we've got a beam coming out of our eye. So, one of the reasons why we shouldn't do this is we never really know what's going on in other people's lives, especially in England, because it's just not our culture, is it? You have all kinds of stuff going on. No one else will know about it. And so we should never assume we know what's going on in someone else's life. We don't know what's going on in people's prayer times, in their personal life. So it's very unsafe to assume we're in a better place than someone else. So instead of that, let's focus on our own lives instead. And if we find ourselves continually judging other people, then what I'd suggest is we need to get back to the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, spend time meditating on those verses again, mourning over our sin, realizing that we are poor in spirit. And if we do that, we will find that we start disliking our sin. And we want to dislike what Jesus dislikes. And he really dislikes this. Check it out. Jesus really dislikes this bit in verse 4, right? When he says, how can you say to your brother, there's disapproval there. For you Greek scholars who want to look it up later, the word used is pos. And it's used in questions that denote disapproval or rejection. So it's like he's saying, with what right can you say this? Or he's saying, how dare you say this? It's not something that Jesus likes. Somehow he manages to mix in the humor with letting people know, I dislike this. I don't want you guys doing this. And this is evident from the fact that God will judge us for it as well. So it's blatantly something God doesn't like. So there's also a practical point, which is that you won't be able to help other people when you have your own problems. You know, you got this beam coming out of your eye, you can't get close enough to the person to help them. And the other thing is, you can't see clearly. Like if I went to the opticians and then the guy's in front of me like this, and he's got these tweezers, And he's like, don't worry, mate, I'll sort you out. I would be petrified. I'd be running out of there as fast as I can. And Jesus is letting us know this. He's saying you can't see clearly enough to do it. And this is important, I think, because a lot of people avoid their problems by trying to help other people. I know when I was at university, it was a popular thing that people said. Whenever someone was going through a hard time, the advice people were given was, you need to start doing something for people. Maybe you could become a nurse or a social worker, all these kind of things. And of course, growing up in an area where lots of people are affected by social workers' lives, to me, that was petrifying. All these people with problems are being advised, why don't you become a social worker? Thinking, no! So people have the power to take kids away from people's homes, get people committed. But this is the way the world thinks. It's like, all you need to do is go and work with orphan kids in Calcutta and then you'll be fine. This kind of thinking. And there's missionaries, counselors, psychologists, all kinds of people who've got problems they're not dealing with, and they're trying to help other people instead. I heard that the suicide rate amongst psychologists is incredibly high. That should put you off wanting to go and see one of them. So if any of us want to help other people, our priority is to deal with our own sin first. That's the first thing we want to do. And this is what Jesus says next. Verse 5, you hypocrite, first remove the beam from your own eye, and then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now the point here, well, first, does anyone remember what hypocrite means in the Greek? A role player or an actor. What Jesus is saying here is, don't be an actor. Don't be an actor. And in this case, the reason why it's acting is, first off, because of our unfair criticism is disguised in the outward form of a kind act. We're seeing all these specks in our friends and we're getting annoyed by it. And then what we do is we say, let me help you with that, friend. And really, it's because we're so annoyed at the speck. And it's not really because we're doing it out of a loving gesture. So we're acting, and that's not what disciples are called to be. The next thing is we act like we're in a better place than we really are. We're trying to make out like, I know all about this problem. I don't have this problem in my life. Let me help you with that problem. Acting. Then we act like we know so much about other people, but in reality we don't know much about ourselves because we've got this big bit of wood in our eye, and we're not even noticing it. And fourthly, we're giving someone a much stricter measurement of judgment than we're applying to our own lives. And this is a tough one here, because we never do apply the same level of judgment to ourselves that we do to other people. And so when we do that, we're being an actor. We're acting like we're all pious, and we're not. We're not consistent with the own standards we set others. So if we really want to if we really want to live like a disciple, we need to listen to what Jesus is saying here. He's saying our first priority is to deal with our sins. Because he says, first, remove the beam from your own eye. So check it out. Warning. Repentance will decrease your chances of being a hypocrite. I want to put this up all over my house. Repentance will decrease your chances of being a hypocrite. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll photocopy them. I was even thinking of getting a T-shirt with it on. The more time we spend on our knees confessing sins to God, the less time we're going to spend judging other people. So the thing I'm getting from this is to really spend more time on my knees confessing sins to God. Less time looking at other people's faults. Getting the wood removed. Now, not only does this make us less judgmental, but it also means that dealing with our own sin enables us to help other people. Because he says, first remove the beam from your own eye, and then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. It's interesting. It shows us here the act of taking a speck out of your brother's eye isn't actually wrong. You know, in the context, Jesus isn't saying we should never take specks out of our brother's eye. But what he's saying is we need to deal with the sin in our own lives first, because otherwise we can't see clearly. It's like the speck can only be removed by someone qualified. Just like you got something stuck in your eye, you probably had it before, you got a bunch of people trying to help you get it out your eye. Blink your eye, spin your eye around lots of time, get some milk, splash it in your, all these kind, and you're thinking, I want to chat to someone who's actually properly qualified. You know, when I was a teenager, I got a pencil in the side of my head. The lead, the graphite snapped off, and it caused me problems. I kept doing that all the time. And people would make fun of me for it. So one night, I just said to people in the dormitory at boarding school, I said, look, can someone get it out? And they got a pair of compasses with the point that you put down and draw something. And people were just having a go. But it was, no one knew what they was doing. And there was one guy in the end who I trusted. He was really smart, one of these like, get A's in everything, you know, do millions of GCSEs type guy. And in the end, I said, Mitch, can you do it? And he did a really good job. Now, it left a right mess. But all these other people were like, here, let's have a go. And it really hurt. You could probably identify if you ever got splinters. And all these people are trying to get it out, and you're like, I want someone qualified to deal with this. So let's not be like these people that are trying to get your splinter out and they just mess you up. Let's make sure we're qualified first. Deal with the sins in our own life, and then we can see clearly that we can help other people. Because before that, we've got distorted vision. And I think it's important for us to know that we do have distorted vision when there's sin in our life. So next time we find ourselves making judgments about people, this is a question to ask yourself. Am I qualified to make this judgment? I could have a whole bunch of t-shirts in it. Am I qualified to make this judgment? Ask yourself that question, and I'm sure most of us are going to be like, no, I'm not qualified. It's time to shut up now. Matthew's not an easy book, is it? This is hard teaching here. So next time we're going to judge someone, let's remember who we're standing before. We're standing before God as a sinner who needs mercy. And we want mercy from God. So let's not judge other people. Now the next verse gets a bit tricky. This is the last verse. Matthew 7, verse 6. Do not give what is holy to dogs, or throw your pearls before pigs. Otherwise they will trample them under their feet and turn around and tear you to pieces. Now there's a problem with this verse in that we honestly don't know whether this is supposed to follow the flow of what we've just been looking at, or if it's a new section. This is the only gospel it's found in, so we can't look at the other gospels to get clues. It could be this is something Jesus said as a separate thing. It could even be Jesus said it as a separate thing, but Matthew chose to put it in here because he can see how it could apply to this as well. What we can say is it looks a lot like a proverb, doesn't it? Looks like something you would read in the book of Proverbs. So it's possible it could have a range of applications. And I think it's important to not try and make it specific to things that it doesn't, in the text, say it is specific to. But there's a bunch of, this is the way I see it, the safest way to read it as a proverb is that it's basically saying, don't give valuable things to people who despise them. And I think the fact that it isn't clearly explained, the fact that it's in Proverbs language, means you could use this to apply to a number of different situations. It doesn't appear to be specific. But if it is following on from what Matthew said, it could be saying, don't give advice to people who will despise it. You know, like there's a time for taking the speck out of your brother's eye, if you've dealt with the sin in your own life first, and if you're doing it with right motives. There could be a time and place for that. But there's some people, when you give them your pearls of wisdom, they're not going to appreciate it. And it's interesting, I've heard of pastors who have been slated for phoning people up. You know, some denominations, you get a phone call at 2 o'clock if you didn't turn up to church. Now, I do it sometimes, but it's not with the thing of telling someone off or something. Most churches, I think, you don't get the phone call. I got in trouble, well, that makes it sound dramatic. I had a meeting years ago with someone when I was in a position of leadership. They'd been backsliding. They'd been going to nightclubs and doing all kinds of things. And they had this meeting with me, and they said, why haven't you been phoning me up? And I was just like, I thought you wanted to do your thing and you decided you were going to live this kind of lifestyle, so, you know, I let you go. And they had a problem with me that I wasn't phoning them up. Now, it's hard because you hear pastors get slated then when they do phone people up, and other people they get slated when they don't phone them up. And I think it's an example of this. Sometimes some people won't appreciate someone looking out for them, and then some people won't appreciate someone being like, okay, we're just going to let them go. So maybe this is a way the proverb could be applied. The other thing is, because it says what is holy, some people say it could be referring to the gospel. And it's interesting that Jesus, you know, did tell them, when you go to a town, if they don't accept it, then wipe the dust off your feet and move on. So it appears to be there's a range of applications you could apply this to. Back then, dogs weren't like dogs these days. People go, oh, look at the little dog. You know, probably your kids wouldn't go up to and say, oh, it's a doggy. Because dogs back then were scavengers. They were even known to consume human blood. Okay? And I don't know how they did that, but that's what I read, that they were known to consume human blood. Now, stray dogs would growl at people, and they were even known to growl at people who would chuck them food. You can imagine that. There's a scraggly old dog there, and you think, oh, I'll give him some food, and suddenly he's like, ah, like he wants to eat you. And I think this is some people's experience. See someone who needs help, try and help them, suddenly they're like, ah. And then the dogs will turn around and tear you to pieces. A lot of people say the construction of this sentence means that the pigs are the guys that trample the pearls underfoot, and the dogs are the guys that turn and tear you to pieces. So you throw your pearls of wisdom to pigs, and they don't appreciate them. Like, this isn't food. They have no idea that they could buy all the food in the world with these pearls. They just trample them. And the dogs, you give them something holy, and they turn around and tear you to pieces. And this is good to know, because this shows that sometimes the problem isn't us, but it's the recipients. If you've ever tried witnessing to someone and they've bitten your head off, you can be like, oh, hang on a minute. This is okay because it says throw your pearls. They do have, what I've got does have a quality to it. It's pearls, and something that is holy, it's holy. So the problem isn't necessarily me, but some people act like pigs. Some people act like dogs. So sometimes it isn't our fault. Sometimes we try and offer someone a helping hand, and they bite our hand off. And it's comforting to know that Jesus identified this. It's a proverb, and you can remind yourself of it and take comfort in it. And also know that, because people have heard this teaching now, well, we all hear it. In Matthew, it says, don't judge. It's interesting. Here we see that Jesus isn't saying, be stupid. He's still saying, you guys have still got to use your heads. There's a time to make a judgment and say, this person isn't receiving what I've got to give them right now, so I'm going to back off. The thing I'd be careful about is just assuming, though, that everyone is a pig or a dog first. So, it says in Proverbs 23, verse 9, do not speak in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Well, let's sum this up. We can see from this last bit that when he says don't judge, it doesn't mean we have to be completely undiscerning. That's not what he's telling us. It doesn't mean we have to trust everyone, and it doesn't mean we have to pretend that everything's wonderful. Because if we do that, we could end up in some dodgy situations. We could have dogs turning around and tearing us to pieces. But at the same time, we can get in trouble by constantly judging other people, judging our brothers and sisters because of the small speck in their eyes. And in which case, we're going to get in trouble with God, which is much worse than getting in trouble with people. So it's a hard balance, and I think the only way to achieve it is by having a sense of sin in our own life. There was a guy teaching at the Leaders' Conference yesterday in Oxford, and a well-known pastor from California, and he said, I'm pond scum. You know? And I thought that's a good outlook to have. You know, when you know that you're pond scum, you're not going to look at other people and be saying, they're rubbish. Because you're aware that you're a terrible sinner that is saved by grace. So thank God, God looks at us, we're holy and blameless in his sight, but it's only because of Jesus' blood, not because of any works that we've done. So we must be careful of judging people. We've got to be very careful. We've got to remember that God will judge us with the same measure that we judge others. So however we deal with other people, God will deal with us in the same way. And we must deal with the planks or the beams in our own life before worrying about the specks in other people's lives. Write it on the wall when you get home. Don't forget this. Because we're all going to stand before God one day. So let's be merciful to others the same way we want God to be merciful to us.